Okay. Once again, not a huge crowd. Hopefully, people will come back once they're at the regular time. Uh, all right. So there's two main things that I want to talk about today. Hopefully, I'll get to both of them. The first one is um, mechanism, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. Locke doesn't use this term, but this is the term for the type of view he has. And the second one is abstraction. And if I don't completely get to abstraction, I'll have to be left over till next time. Um, okay, so um, erase abstraction for now. What is mechanism? Well, first of all, mechanism is about bodies. So, um, what is a body? Well, uh, as I think I've mentioned before, or maybe I haven't, um, in this course, we're using body here in a very broad sense, right? It doesn't mean like a human body or something like that. It just means anything like the air in this room is a body. Um, it means something that occupies a certain part of space, or that is something extended. Right? This is the technical term for um, taking up space or having parts outside of parts is the traditional definition. Um, Now, the body isn't the extension itself, um, although Locke doesn't always keep careful track of this, but the body is what is extended. It's an extended substance, right? So a body is an extended substance. We haven't um, got to talking about substance yet in this course, but we will. Um, but for now, it just means like something that has properties, right? So extension is the property, and the body is what has the property of extension. So there's certain other properties that something that, and this definition of body is ancient, right? Like everyone defines body this way, and so does Locke, and Kant will again define body this way. Um, and if something has this property of extension, there's certain other properties it also has to have. Um, they're necessary concomitants of extension, or they're modes of extension. It has to have size, or as Locke says, bulk. Bulk is his word for, I think, what we call volume, right? So it has to have a three-dimensional size. It has to have bulk. It has to have shape or figure. Um, it has to have position and motion or rest. These two, at least, and this is how Locke is going to understand them relative to other bodies, right? Position is going to be defined as position relative to some other bodies, and motion and rest is going to be defined as motion and rest relative to some other bodies. So, right, something that's extended has to have these properties because something that's extended takes up a part of space. So That is, it takes up a certain amount of space, and not all of it. That's why it has bulk. And that's also why it has figure, because since it doesn't take up all of space, it reaches a limit, right? And the limit has a certain characteristic, which is what we call shape or figure. Um, it has to have position because it has to take up some part of space and not some other part of space. Although again, um, Locke uh, doesn't talk about parts that space has like absolutely, not relatively. He's interested in the parts that of space that we can identify relative to some other body. So if I've got some other body here, and my body that I'm talking about, A, is over here, so it has to, I mean, that is, my body has to be, the body I'm talking about has to be somewhere relative to this one. It has to be either here or here or here. So that's its position. And then finally, as you move through time, the body either remains in the same position, again, relative to this other body, or it doesn't remain in the same position. It's in a new position, and therefore it's either in motion or at rest. So this is an almost complete list of the properties that Locke thinks every body as such has to have. But there's one more that Locke will add, and that most people will add, although Descartes doesn't. Um, and it has to do with what it means to take up space, right? Like, what is extension means that the body takes up a certain part of space, but what does it mean to take it up? So the answer is, uh, and so far Descartes also agrees with this, it excludes other bodies from that space, right? So while the body is taking up a certain part of space, no other body can also be there. But what Locke adds, and what most people add, although not Descartes, is that the body excludes other bodies because it has a certain power by which it resists them. So uh, this body A won't let any other body into its space while it's there. So some other body, and Locke says this is absolute resistance. That is, he thinks that um, um, bodies can't be compressed. It has an absolute limit, and no other body can cross that limit. So it can't kind of like squeeze it in. Why does it look like bodies can be squeezed in? Because, you know, when we think about like a sponge being squeezed in, it has holes in it, and part of the body moves into where the hole was, and some of the air or water moves out of the hole. And right, so like different bodies are moving around, but none is actually moving into the space of another while it's there. So this body will absolutely resist this body going into this space as long as this body is here. And that power of resistance is what Locke calls solidity. Right? He says he's not sure solidity is the right name for this, and if you prefer to call it impenetrability, he's okay with that too. Um, but he thinks solidity is the best word for it, and that's what he goes with. Um, so this quality of solidity, understanding it this way, and I say understanding it this way because we'll see in the end that there's something weird about the quality or power of solidity. That there seem to be two different ways to understand it. But understanding it this way, as the power to absolutely resist any other body moving into its space while it's there, Um, this power of solidity explains how one body can move another, right? Because let's say this one is moving. When it gets to here, it can't go into the space that body A is in. So either we'll have to stop or body A will have to move out of the way. Now, Locke, unlike Descartes um, uh, or Newton, um, doesn't like try to work out a way of calculating exactly what will happen in this situation. I mean, so he knows about Newton, he respects Newton, but it doesn't seem to me like he really has assimilated Newton's physics very well. Um, so, uh, but it, in any case, that's not his job. Certainly not in this book, right? He's not interested in explaining, predicting exactly what will happen. Will this one stop? Will right? But but he is interested in this, namely that it's by definition of body that if this one's going to keep moving, this one will have to move out of the way because they can't both be in the same place at the same time. Um, okay, so this is um, no, I guess I'll start with this. Mechanism is the view um, that the only properties that bodies really have are the properties on this list, extension and its modes. At least that's the way I would define mechanism. There's different ways of understanding what that word means out there, but I think this is the proper use for it. It's called mechanism because it means that, so if these are the only properties bodies have, then this is the only way one body can change another, by pushing it. So everything in the world works like a machine in the sense that there's like, little gears and stuff, like little pieces pushing each other. Um, so again, mechanism is the view that these are the only body properties that bodies really have. Well, I mean, you may need to add also number and duration, um, but that's kind of weird, and I won't talk about that. At least not now. But for the most part, this is the list, right? Other properties. So, in other words, a whole body has these properties, and if it's divisible into parts, and Locke thinks that every body is divisible into parts. That's worth paying attention to because Berkeley and Hume are going to deny that. But Locke thinks every body is divisible into parts. So every whole body has these properties and only these properties, and all of its parts also have these properties and only these properties. And I mean, obviously there are rules, right? Like if the body has a certain bulk, then its parts have smaller bulk and so forth. Um, so what about the other properties we usually attribute to bodies, like color, taste, smell, sound? Although we don't usually think of sound as a property of a body, actually. That one's kind of weird. But in any case, heat and cold. Um, so mechanism means that those properties, although we attribute them to bodies, were mistaken. They're not really in bodies. They're really only in us, in our sensations. Right? So, like, defined that way, a lot of people, almost everyone in the early modern period agree with this. I mean, the first one probably is Galileo. So it's not, and Descartes also. as I said, has his version of this. So it's not something that Locke invented. Um, but what we're seeing here is Locke's version of it. Newtonian mechanics, at least the way people came to understand it, is clearly violates this, right? Because bodies have another property, mass. And they have another way of working on each other by attraction. So there's right, so there's no mechanistic explanation. Um, uh, but as I said, Locke, although he respects Newton, does not really seem to me to have followed what Newton was saying carefully. Um, all right. So this is so what we're seeing, among other things, in this reading is Locke's version of this principle. And Locke marks his version of this principle by this terminology. He calls these primary qualities. Right? So these properties that the body has are its primary qualities.
I did like
And
3 rounds where I would just like see how far up the hill
um,
I could get.
Yeah, where are you up to?
Oh my gosh.
someone's not muted.
Have fun.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Um, he calls these primary qualities. Um, and he calls all those others, like color and smell and whatever, secondary qualities. Now, he also didn't invent that terminology. Um, uh, he didn't even invent this particular way of using it exactly. It's pretty much found in Boyle, who was, remember, was one of his mentors. Um, but he's the one who made it most famous uh, in this use. I say in this use because there's an ancient use of primary qualities in which the primary qualities are hot, cold, wet, and dry. So um, um, I think actually that Boyle and Locke are intending to continue that ancient terminology, but making a point against it, that it's not those, but rather these that are primary qualities. But I'm not going to go into that. So for our purposes, we can think of primary and secondary qualities as Locke's terminology, right? So the primary qualities are, um, we know, I mean, we know this just because I said so, right? I haven't quoted Locke about this yet, but the primary qualities are the qualities that are really in bodies. Um, so the question is, number one, what does Locke mean by that? And number two, why does he think it's true? You can't really explain why he thinks it's true unless you figure out what he means by it. So I'm going to talk about the first one first. Um, and I'm going to introduce this distinction um, um, between and Locke uses this, but he doesn't explain exactly what it means. I think he thinks you know already what it means. Um, so it's a distinction. I mean, strictly speaking, it's a distinction between ways of denominating something. And denomination by one side of the distinction is denomination by properties or by real properties, and the other is denomination by powers or by bare powers. So what denomination is in general is um, a name of something that's derived from a name of something else or from another name anyway. That's part of the question, is whether it's the name of something else. So for example, whiteness is a name, and from its whiteness, the snowball is denominated white. Um, Now, uh, the question between these two types of denomination, the question is the snowball's whiteness a thing, or isn't it? So if the snowballs, and remember again that this word real comes from the Latin word res, which means thing, right? So a real property is a property that is a thing. So like here's the snowball, and here's another thing, it's whiteness. And this should seem familiar from the first lecture when I talked about realism versus nominalism, right? Believing that whiteness is a real property is realism about whiteness. So, on the other hand, um, a bare power. So, like, the reason it's a bare power is because it's only a power. Like, a power could also be a real property. That is, something can have a power or faculty or capacity because of a real property that inheres in it, right? So, for example, if Locke were a realist about whiteness, but he's not, but if he were, right, then he would say that the snowball has the quality of, that is the power of looking white because of the whiteness that is in it. That would be an example of a power that wasn't a bare power. But a bare power means that there is no separate thing by virtue of which the snowball has this power. And I mean, um, um, as I mentioned before, medieval nominalists said this about, for example, the snowball's quantity. Well, I guess, I mean, they didn't really think of it as a power. Think of quantity as a power. Yeah, maybe. What I always have a hard time explaining this, and I always run into the same problem at this point in the lecture, which is that so Locke and the medieval nominalists like William of Ockham are using this terminology the same way, but they have almost completely disagree on what are real properties and what aren't. Like this almost the reverse, right? So this actually is one of the few cases where William of Ockham is a realist. He says, yeah, sensible qualities like whiteness are different things from the substance, from the subject in which they inhere. Um, Whereas Locke is going to say that almost all of those are not real properties. So they have it almost like totally reversed. Um, but okay, so let me use, so therefore it's hard to find it's hard to find good examples because every example, some like different people say the opposite thing about. But like this is an example that they probably would agree about. Anyway, it's Locke's example, right? He says, the sun has the power to melt wax. So remember, the sun has the power to melt wax even when there's no wax there, right? I mean, the power is in act when the wax is melting, but if there's no wax, it still has the power. But now the question is there something, is there a thing in the sun that is its power to melt wax? Or is it just that the sun, being the kind of thing it is, like very hot and whatever, um, is just by virtue of that melts wax? And Locke says, and again, I think William of Ockham would agree with this, that that's a bare power. So it's the second answer is the right answer. The sun, there isn't some separate thing in the sun that's the power to melt wax. Um, it's um, it's just a way of denominating the sun itself indirectly. So instead of calling it the sun, I call it the wax melting thing. Um, but there isn't some uh, real property that I'm using to do that. Are there questions about this? Because I know that no matter how I explain this, uh, it's usually most people usually find it difficult. Okay. I was hoping at least Carl would have. Yes. All right. Um, so, right. So, I mean, the idea of this, well, if we just say denomination by properties versus by powers, like the idea behind it is that everything that's really a property is a real property, and these are just powers. But, what gets nominalism of various kinds going is at least this in this corner of nominalism. There's nominalism about universals as other issues, but like in this part of nominalism, what gets it going is, among other things, is the suspicion that some of the things that we think are real properties are actually just bare powers. Um, and um, again, I think William of Ockham and Locke agree about that, but they disagree about what examples that applies to. So again, Occam thinks in this case we're not mistaken when we think that there's such a thing as whiteness that the snowball has, and by having that's why it looks white. Um, and Locke thinks we are mistaken. Um, so Locke isn't the first, and on the other hand, properties like shape, quantity, that is things that we think of as real properties like shape and quantity, and size are exactly the things that Occam is going to say are not real properties. Right? So Occam will say that the size of the snowball is not a thing. And as I said when I discussed this example before, it's kind of, you can see why someone would say this. It seems kind of weird to say that the snowball is one thing and its size is something else. And because it has that other thing, that's why it has its volume or bulk. So William of Ockham, in the case of the things that Locke is calling primary qualities, William of Ockham is a nominalist about those, and he's a realist about at least some of the things that Locke is calling secondary qualities. But then this gets reversed in Locke. And actually, again, Locke is not the first one to reverse it. It gets reversed in Galileo and in Boyle. But I think Locke is the first one who has um, a precise explanation for what it means and why this reversal has to happen. Um, and the answer turns on the question, uh, what do we actually mean when we say that there's a thing called whiteness in the body that corresponds to our idea of white? Um, so, um, so part of Locke's answer is just framing it this way, right? I mean, and framing it this way is what makes it into a distinction between two different kinds of quality in Locke's terminology. So remember, by quality, Locke means a power in the body to cause some kind of perception in me. So here's the external body, like the snowball, and it has a certain power. And the power is the power. I guess I can put this in here. These last words. All right. Power is to cause the power to cause me to have this mental operation of sensing white, right? Where this is the idea of white. So for Locke, the question about whether um, whether this idea is the product of a quality that is really in the body is, first of all, this question: is this power a real power, or is it just a bare power? And again, in the case of white, Locke will say it's a bare power. Okay, but he also so notice, like in one sense of really in the body, primary and secondary qualities are both really in the body, right? I mean, the body really does have a quality by means of which it causes me to perceive white. It has to, right? Because it causes me to perceive white. That's the operation. So if if it has the operation of causing me to perceive white, then it must have been able to cause me to perceive white, and that's the power, right? Um, so secondary qualities and primary qualities are both powers in the body. So when Locke says that the primary qualities are really in the body and the secondary qualities aren't, he means it in some weird technical sense. And that's the sense I'm trying to explain, right? Because again, the qualities, where else could the qualities be? The qualities are powers of the body, so they're in the body. That is, the body has those powers, right? I mean, saying they're in it is like a metaphor for saying the body has those powers. Um, so, and what I just said was part of what he means is that a primary quality is a real power, is not a bare power, but it is a power based on a real property. Whereas a secondary quality isn't. So in the case of a secondary quality, like the quality of whiteness, the body for sure has a power to make me perceive white, but that power is not a separate thing in the body. Now, we still don't really understand exactly what Locke means by that. Um, and and it's not probably exactly what William of Ockham means by it. In fact, Locke is thinking of it in a more abstract way than his predecessors did, I think. So, and the key to understanding how this works, I think, is one other thing that Locke adds about primary qualities. So maybe, but I'm going to erase this now, I guess. Let's set that to the edge. there's two differences here. The primary quality is a real power, a real property. You understand, right? Like, the reason I put real in parentheses and bare in parentheses is because you might just say it's a distinction between properties and powers, but you could also say it's a property distinction between real properties and bare power, or real powers and bare powers. Um, so the primary quality is a real power. The secondary quality is a bare power. But Locke says one other thing about this, which is the primary qualities resemble something in the body. And the secondary qualities not do not resemble anything in the body. Um, now, you might ask, what does this even mean? So, like, how can I compare the quality? So I guess I should have said the idea, Locke himself does this here, and it's getting me confused. The idea of the primary quality resembles something in the body. The idea of the secondary quality doesn't. That's what Locke actually says. Although again, in this reading is where he warns that he's not always going to be careful about this. Sometimes he talks as if the quality is in us, like the idea. Sometimes he talks as if the idea is in the body. Right? But strictly speaking, there's an idea in me, like the idea white, and there's a quality in the body, which is a power to cause me to perceive that idea. And Locke says that in the case of secondary qualities, that idea doesn't resemble anything in the body. Whereas in the case of primary qualities, the idea resembles something in the body. And the question I was just asking is, what does that mean? Right? Like, how can I compare my idea to the power in the body? So, like, the way the only thing I know about the power in the body, apparently, is that it causes me to perceive that idea. I don't have some other way of perceiving the power. Like I can't like get around the side and look at the power directly and then compare it to the idea. So it can seem like this is nonsense. And I think this is one of those points where some people will stop and say, yeah, Locke is not that bright. This is nonsense. Right? What do you mean an idea resembles something in external body? Because again, like to see an external body means to have the external body cause me to perceive a visual idea. So I can never like see whether the body resembles the idea or not. Seeing the body is seeing the idea. um, but I think Locke, although he doesn't make this very clear, I think Locke is thinking something really important here. And it's important for understanding Locke and also important for understanding some things that happen after Locke, especially in Kant. So, and to explain it, I have to jump ahead a little bit, or a lot actually. So, this is book 4, chapter wrote here chapter oh yeah, book 4 chapter 3 page 485 at the top. Some few of the primary qualities have a necessary dependence and visible connection one with another. As figure necessarily supposes extension, Receiving or communicating motion by impulse supposes solidity. So, um, so the idea here, the thought here is that, and right before that, Locke has been saying how our simple ideas, for the most part, have no necessary connection with each other. I guess I shouldn't have said only this is important for something that happens in Locke. I mean, in Kant, it's important for something that happens in Berkeley and Hume, which we're going to see. But Locke says, I mean, it's Hume who's famous for saying there's no necessary connection between distinct ideas. But Locke is already almost agreeing with that, right? Because Locke says almost none of our simple ideas have any necessary connection to each other. But some few of the primary qualities do have a necessary dependence and visible connection one with another. So, um, so for example, solidity, Locke says, is a simple idea. Now, this already should be surprising given the way I defined solidity before, because you can't define a simple idea. It doesn't have parts, right? So Locke says a complex idea can be defined. You list its parts. And maybe you have to say something about how the parts fit together too. But anyway, you give its parts, and that's the definition. But a simple idea, Locke says, can't be defined, right? So, like, if you've never tasted a pineapple and you ask me, what is the taste of a pineapple? I can't define it for you. All I can do is give you a pineapple and say, here, this is what it tastes like. And Locke says the same thing about solidity. Um, so, right, this was in book 2, chapter 4, which is all about solidity. Chapter 4 of solidity. So, book 2, chapter 4, section 6. If anyone asks me what this solidity is, I send him to his senses to inform him. Let him put a flint or a football between his hands and then endeavor to join them, and he will know. So if you not want to know what solidity is, a simple idea, and if you want to know what it is, the only way is to receive it through your senses, because right, there's only two ways of receiving simple ideas: through your senses or through reflection. And obviously, it's not going to be reflection here because it's a property of bodies, not mental operations. So yeah, you have to. He's going to send you to your senses. You have to get the simple idea. Um, But wait, how does that match up with the idea that the quality of solidity is the power for a body to resist any other body coming into its space? Like, that's a really complex idea. Not really complex, I guess, but that's a somewhat complex idea, right? It contains the idea of body and the idea of motion and the idea of resistance, and right, like that's clearly a complex idea. So I think the answer is, do you understand? This is like a puzzle. It doesn't seem like these things can go together. It's both a simple idea, but we also know this other thing about it. So I think the answer is that this is exactly what he's talking about in that passage from book 4 that I read, when he gives us an example that to find it again. Receiving or communicating motion by impulse supposes solidity. That's supposed to be an example of a visible necessary connection between distinct ideas. So, in other words, solidity itself is a simple idea. It doesn't contain any parts. It's like white, it's a kind of sensation, like whiteness, or sweetness, or whatever. But unlike in the case of whiteness or sweetness, we see a necessary connection between solidity and another idea. And this other idea is, well, communication of motion by impulse, which, as I pointed out before, is just like kind of the flip side of excluding other bodies from your space. So this is not a simple idea, but of course it's composed of simple ideas. So somewhere in here is a necessary relation between distinct simple ideas. So, and Locke said, so how do we know this? How do we know? That is, what we know is that whatever gives me that sensation. So, like when I put the football between my hands, right? And the example of football is to show that even bodies that are soft have this absolute solidity, right? We think they're soft because it's easy to get them to move out of the way. But if they can't move out of the way, like the air in a football, then they're going to resist, right? So, like, I don't know whether his football was shaped like an American football or a soccer ball or what, but anyway, so I put the football between my hands. I think he uses that example because Descartes, when he denies that solidity belongs to bodies, talks about the possibility that every body will move away whenever I push it. So Locke says, aha, put it between your hands. Now what's going to So anyway, I put the football between my two hands. I feel this, I try to move them together. I feel this sensation like whiteness, and I know that um, the football will never let my hands move closer together unless it moves out of the way. So this is an example of what Kant would call synthetic a priori. Synthetic means it's not true by definition. And it can't be true by definition because, again, solidity doesn't have a definition. It's simple. So it doesn't contain anything. And in particular, it doesn't contain in itself this idea of resisting the motion of another body. Nevertheless, um, we know this just from comparing these ideas, not from experience. That's why it's a priori, right? Just by inspecting the ideas, we see that there's a visible necessary connection between them. So, like, this is why I said that before, that Locke's empiricism is somewhat limited. All the ingredients here, the ideas have to come through our senses, according to Locke, right? So Kant is going to disagree with that, right? Kant thinks there are pure concepts that that is, in Locke's terminology, more or less pure ideas that we didn't get through our senses, and therefore there are pure a priori truths. Locke says no, but Locke thinks every idea here has to have come through the senses at some time. So I'm either sensing it now or remembering it. But the proposition that connects them isn't known by experience. Um, And it's only in the case of some few primary qualities. But I think I mean, there are only a few primary qualities, right? I think, I think he means that in some few cases there are visible necessary connections between primary qualities. Um, okay, so uh, we'll talk more about that in book 4 and about like how that's supposed to make geometrical demonstrations possible. Um, but um, but what I want to point out now is how this is related to the question of whether there's a real power in the body corresponding to our idea. And as I said, Locke is thinking about this question about whether there's a thing there in a much more abstract way, right? So you shouldn't think of the question as like whether there's a little piece. Now, I mean, everyone knows that, right? Like William of Ockham doesn't think that whiteness is a little piece of something inside, right? And in fact, that's part of Aristotle's definition of accident. Everyone has to agree that whiteness is not a part of the white thing. But still, like when we think about this question, we tend to think of the whiteness being somewhere like kind of it's spread over, it's like a little film that's spread over the surface, or it's a little Dorito that's stuck in and doing this, like emitting this whiteness power or something like that. But Locke, I think, is thinking of it this way. Um, do we know something about the structure of the thing by virtue of which it caused this idea in us? Uh-oh. I just got a message saying my internet connection is unstable. Oh, that's because the microwave's on. It'll stop. It's fine. It will stop. All right. Um, so, because, you know, this idea, I was caused to perceive this idea by a certain power that the body has. I was caused to perceive this idea, or the simple ideas that make it up, but let's say I'm actually watching the body resisting. I was caused to perceive this idea by a power in the body that caused me to perceive that idea. There's a necessary connection between these two ideas. Therefore, there's a necessary connection between these two powers. So I know something about the body beyond just that it has the power to cause me to perceive this idea, and it has the power to cause me to perceive this idea, and it has the power to cause me. I know that in the body, there are two powers that necessarily go together. Or another way of putting this is that I know that there's something in the body that's analogous to this, a structure in the body that's analogous to this structure in my ideas. Like when I combine a subject with a predicate here, and say that they necessarily go together, it's reflecting something about the way something necessarily goes with something in the body. So for example, like if you look, again, looking ahead, this time just a little bit, to book 2, chapter 13, section 6, on page 163, Locke is talking about how we form the ideas of different shapes. And he says, for the mind having a power to repeat the idea of any length directly stretched out and join it to another in the same direction, which is double the length of that straight line, or else to join it to another with what inclination it thinks fits, and to make what sort of angle it pleases, et cetera, et cetera. That's how we're able to form the idea of a fit, right? So we take our existing idea of lines and we put them together at different angles and we lengthen and shorten them until we get a shape. But, you know, so Locke doesn't discuss this question here, but I think it's implied by what he's going to say about geometrical demonstration in book 4. Like, we know for sure that the mind can't form a closed figure using 2 lines. There have to be 3, at least. And if there are 3, certain things have to be true of them. Like, for example, this one has to be shorter than the sum of these 2. That's called a triangle inequality. How do we know that? Well, I think the answer is this is another example of visible necessary connections between the ideas of primary qualities. Um, Now, I mean, it might seem like you're going to need a lot of these necessary connections, but probably Locke thinks, and he's probably right, that we only need a few to get the axioms of geometry, and then we can go on from there, right? But in any case, like whether this is kind of primitive or derived, there's like necessary truths we know about how lines can fit together that we don't know from experience, but we know by comparing the ideas. So the mind just simply can't combine 2 lines in such a way as to enclose a space. Um, and therefore, even though um, we don't know, these ideas are not in the body. So if by triangle you mean this idea in my mind, the body is not a triangle. But because of these necessary relationships, like for example, there have to be 3 of something here. We know that there's some kind of at least 3ness in the body. So there's something in the body that's analogous to the shape in my mind in that sense. Right? Like it has 3ness. It has greater than and less than and some. So you can, right? Because it like the powers to cause the perception of lines in it have to ensure that when I see a closed figure enclosed by 3 lines, the sum of 2 sides is greater than the length of the third. And that's what Locke means when he says that these ideas resemble something in the object. Right? Resemble actually has a long history as a technical term of meaning exactly this, like analogy, or more generally speaking, um, as we would say, isomorphism, right? Like we don't know what things in the body have these necessary relationships to each other, so to speak, but we know that they have the same necessary relationships as our ideas. Okay. Are there questions about that? I know it's going really quick from from thinking about whether there's a thing in the body that is a property to this more abstract question about whether we know something about the structure of the external thing. Yeah, Carl.
How can Locke be so sure that the necessary connections aren't coming from our mind or like the operation, the way our mind works, etc.?
Um, that's a good question. And it's a question that Hume and Kant are going to say has no answer, right? They're going to say there's no such thing as perceiving a necessary connection. It can't work that way, right? And Hume is going to take that to mean, at least in the treatise, how he thinks about geometry and the inquiry is less clear, at least to me. But you know, Hume is gonna take that to mean that we really don't know things like this. Uh, so whereas Kant is going to try to explain how we do know them, even though there's no such thing as a visible necessary connection. So,
So
um,
Locke doesn't really talk about it or
well, I
discuss it.
mean, I guess I would say, I mean, Locke thinks that if you have the ideas, you will assent to the proposition, right? Like, so you know they necessarily go together in that way. Um, but so actually to get to Hume and Kant's position takes a little bit of work to explain why no, that can never be passive. It has to be like, it has to be my principle, right? It has to be my concept that makes that contains that knowledge. It can't be something that comes to me from the object, right? So I mean, so yeah, what Locke is saying is not ridiculous, um, but nevertheless, it's right to question it. That was a good question. All right, I'm going to go on to talk about abstraction, I think, which, anything else I wanted to say here? Oh, I guess I could talk here about, we already talked about this. Um, I mean, I guess I'll just say there's one more, well, there's probably a lot more, but there's one more important question like this that you can bring up, which again is going to be really important, the contrast to Berkeley and Hume, which is, remember, I said Locke thinks that we know every body is divisible. Um, so so the question is, how do we know that bodies that um, are just, well, there's a number of questions, but one way you could put the question is, how do we know that bodies that are just big enough for us to see are divisible? We never see them divide into two parts. Now, whether there's really such a thing as a body that's just big enough to see, I'm not exactly sure, uh, um, but they don't argue on that point, so let's assume there is. Um, Actually, maybe Locke would actually deny that, whereas Hume definitely wouldn't. But that is, Hume definitely thinks that's obvious. That if some bodies can be seen and others are too small to see, there has to be one exactly at the limit. That's like a general principle Hume applies to everything. So anyway, so you take a body that's just exactly big enough for us to see. We never see it divided into two pieces. How could we know that it's divisible? And furthermore, how do we know that if it does have pieces, that those pieces are solid? I guess I should say that they're too small for us to feel, which actually is the way Locke brings this up. So, right, going back to chapter 4, paragraph 1 on page 125, he says, um, about solidity. This of all others seems the idea most intimately connected with and essential to body, so as nowhere else to be found or imagined, but only in matter. And though our senses take no notice of it, and though our senses take no notice of it, but in masses of matter of a bulk sufficient to cause a sensation in us, yet the mind, having once got this idea from such grosser sensible bodies, traces it further, and considers it, as well as figure, in the minutest particle of matter that can exist, and finds it inseparably inherent in body, wherever or however modified. Right. And I think, along with that, saying that we the mind traces the properties of solidity and figure into the smallest bodies, it's also going to trace divisibility, right? Like again, those things go together. So, but how does the mind do that? Not by experience, obviously. The whole point is that this is taking us beyond the range of our experience. So again, I think the answer is that Locke thinks that that's, as Kant would say, synthetic a priori. We know not by experience, but by expecting the relationship between these ideas that every body is divisible into parts that are also bodies. And so they're also divisible, etc. Okay, now I'm going to talk about abstraction. It's going to involve another weird paradox, at least. But okay, so remember, Locke thinks there are a lot of operations of, right? There are a lot of mental operations, or in other words, there are a lot of mental faculties. And when they're in act, they're operations. Um, and in this part of book 2, there's like a list of, I don't think it's supposed to be a list of all of them, but it's at least all the ones that are important to gaining knowledge. And the first one is perception, which I'm not sure I understand this properly, but I think Locke is using perception here. It doesn't mean sensation, and it doesn't even mean sensation or reflection. It means just entertaining an idea and not doing a further operation on it. So at first, before we formed any complex ideas, the object of perception is always going to be a simple idea of sense or reflection. But later on, the object of reflection perception could be any idea. Right. But perception is the first operation because before you can do anything else, we have to like have the idea just as an object of our thought. Just see that it's there, so to speak. Again, anytime seeing comes in here, it's a metaphor and a weird metaphor that's likely to get us tangled up because real seeing involves an idea. Right? Like really seeing something means having an idea that refers you on to that thing, that the external thing that you're seeing. But this kind of seeing doesn't involve another idea, right? It's not an infinite regress. So it's really actually quite different from seeing. It's immediate. But anyway, Locke talks that way, and I don't see any way to avoid it, right? So we have to like at first kind of see that the idea is there, and then we can start to do other operations on it. Um, Now, um, that's the first operation and obviously very important. And the most important operation after perception is abstraction. So, um, but in between, there's a series of other operations which Locke says make abstraction possible. Right. And as I mentioned last time, as we go up the list, right? So he says all animals have perception, he thinks. He's not sure, but he conjectures that all animals have perception. Like, how could we tell? I, I mean, although to this day people say things like that, and we still have the same question. How can we tell? But anyway, so Locke says he thinks all animals have perception, but then as he goes further on in the list, he says that non-human animals, that is beasts, right? A beast is a non-human animal. And most of the time when we kind of carelessly say animals when we mean non-human animals, and therefore forget that humans are also animals. But Locke is usually pretty careful about that because he's always remembering that humans are a kind of animal. So anyway, so as we go up the list or down the list, I don't know, Locke starts saying, but beasts do this very little. And beasts do this little, if at all. And then when he gets to abstraction, he says that this marks the difference between humans and other animals. That right, no other animals can do this, as far as he knows. Again, I think if you said, I mean, because later he's gonna entertain the possibility that someone, Prince Maurice, tells a story about meeting a rational parrot in Brazil. And Locke says, well, Prince Maurice is a pretty trustworthy guy. I guess maybe it's true, right? So like if he was convinced that there was a rational parrot, which presumably would be able to carry out abstraction, he he would say, oh yeah, only humans and parrots can do it. All right, but as far as he knows, only humans can do it. So, and only adult humans, like infants, also can't do it. Um, So how does abstraction work? Well, so I think I'm going to get a better head start at this than I do most years, but I'm still going to have to think some of this over for next time, but we'll see what happens. But so I'm going to come at this from a kind of weird direction. Um, but maybe like to make the direction seem a little less weird, I'll point out that the first operation after perception is memory. This has a long history. That's also Aristotle says the first operation after sense is memory. Um, so, and memory has something to do with it's something, or at least this is how Locke thinks of memory. It's something like sensing something, but the thing's not here. But I know that I had this same idea in the past when the thing was here. Right? That's what memory is like. So what is this thinking that the thing is here? That's the first question I want to talk about. So um so there are certain ideas, and they're kind of weird ideas, that Locke says come along with every other. And among these are definitely existence and unity, right? So he lists these in book 2, chapter 7, section 7. Exists, so chapter 7, he's talking about ideas that come to us by both sense and reflection. And then he gets to this. Uh, Existence and unity are two other ideas that are suggested to the understanding by every object without and every idea within. When ideas are in our minds, we consider them as being actually there, as well as we consider things to be actually without us, which is that they exist or have existence. That far is about existence, and then he says, and whatever we consider as one thing, whether a real being or idea, suggests the understanding the idea of unity. So existence and unity are two ideas that are suggested by every other idea. I think these are the only ones that Locke says this explicitly about, but I think we could probably add power and possibly also limit to this list. I'm least sure about this. But Locke does say that these are all simple ideas. Um, so, what does it mean to say that they come in with, well, okay, no, maybe I should say, why do I think that power comes in with every idea also? Well, because, like, how do I get the idea of the power to cause me to see white? Well, here's the quality of whiteness. It causes this perception of white. Now, are we going to say that there's also a power, a quality of powerness that causes me to perceive the idea of the power to cause me to perceive white? Like that seems like it's not going to work. It's going to be a regress or something. Right? Do you understand what I'm asking? Like, in other words, every simple idea basically is the idea of the power to cause it, right? Like what it refers to is the power to cause it. So, if we're, it doesn't seem like there's another power that's the power to cause the idea of the power to cause it. So that's why I think the idea of power also, that every time an idea comes in, it comes along with the idea of the power to cause me to perceive it. Now, this won't match up exactly with what Locke says in the chapter about power later. So there's, there could be a problem with my interpretation. That's one reason I'm not so sure about this. These, he says explicitly, they come in with every idea. But now what does this mean? That is, obviously, when we say that the idea of a snowball always comes along with the ideas of power and existence, right? And this isn't limited to simple ideas, right? He says every idea comes along with these ideas of unity and existence. So, it, so the idea of a snowball comes along with the ideas of unity and existence, and again, presumably also power. That doesn't mean that I can't think of a snowball without believing that it exists and is operating on me right now. Right? Obviously, I can picture a snowball to myself, even though there's no snowball here. And again, at least the way Locke thinks about that, it's like sensing a snowball. It's like not as strong somehow as actually sensing a snowball, as we'll see both Berkeley and Hume trying to put it. And I just today saw Pseudo Simplicius on the De Anima saying the same thing. So now I'm wondering what the history of that is, but never mind that. So, um, uh, so what do you mean it comes along with the idea of existence? Right? Here I have it, and I don't think it exists. So here it is without the idea of existence. So I think the answer is, well, confine yourself to the simple ideas that make up the snowball. So the simple ideas that make up the snowball certainly came to me in perception at one time, because the mind can't make its own simple ideas. So even though the simple idea doesn't come along with the idea that its object exists now, it comes along with the idea that its object exists at some time. So when we say that the idea of existence that accompanies every idea is the idea of existence at a time, right? And in perception, It's the idea of the existence of the external object now, and also the existence of the idea now. But in the case of memory, it's the idea of the existence of the idea now, but of its object at some previous time. And again, not the whole object, but the simple ideas that make it up, right? So I can imagine a unicorn, even though I've never seen a unicorn, but all the simple ideas that make it up, in effect, are memories, right? Like my imagination of the unicorn is made up out of simple memories, because each one of those simple ideas is the idea of something that I actually have perceived in the past. Um, and so, first of all, this explains how Locke thinks about memory, what it's like. So this is book 2, chapter 10, section 2, on the bottom of page 147. But our ideas being nothing but actual perceptions in the mind, which cease to be anything when there is no perception of them. This, right? So he's talking about, in context, he's talking about how you can think of memory as like ideas that I got at one time, and now I'm like storing them somewhere in my mind and I can bring them back. But he says, strictly speaking, that's not true. The ideas are only there when, and this tells us something about like what he thinks existence is for an idea. The idea only exists when it's being perceived. That's going to be very important in Berkeley. SAS percipi. Right. So it's the idea only really exists when it's being perceived. So what does it mean that I have them stored in my mind? So that's what he's answering in this sentence. Um, but our ideas being nothing but actual perceptions in the mind, which cease to be anything when there is no perception of them. This laying up of our ideas in the repository of memory signifies no more but this, that the mind has a power, in many cases, to revive perceptions which it has once had, with this additional perception annexed to them that it has had them before. So it, like, and again, I think in the case of a complex like fantasy, this the simple parts of it are still like this. They're still memories. I know that I've had them before. Um, and this explains, turning ahead to chapter 11, section 11, page, I must have meant 162. No, that's chapter 13. Chapter 11, section. Oh no, this is okay. This is in book 4. I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention. I'm skipping ahead to something from book 4 again. So, like, spoiler alert. So it is on page 562. Book 4, chapter 11, section 11, on page 562. As when our senses are actually employed about any object, we do know that it does exist. So by our memory, we may be assured that heretofore things that affected our senses have existed. Right? So he's saying memory is like sensation. So in context in book 4, he's talking about the kind of certainty we have that the present objects of our senses are actually there. And I mean, you can see why from this picture, right? Like if I'm perceiving white, something caused me to perceive white. So even though I may be wrong about what this is, I'm not wrong that it's white. That is, has the power to cause me to perceive white. um, and Locke says, and this same certainty attaches to memory, which you might think is surprising, right? Like, isn't there a big difference between remembering things where I'm not sure, did I really see that yesterday or not, versus seeing something right now? But again, I think the way to understand it is to focus on the simple ideas. The simple ideas I certainly perceived at some time in the past. That is, something external caused me to perceive them. So memory in that sense is as certain as perception, however certain that is. Now, I mean, this doesn't mean, of course, that every simple idea comes with a little timestamp that says exactly when I sensed it in the past, right? Like, we don't have that kind of assurance, but it means that ideas and their objects are known to stand in relations of coexistence and succession. So, like, I know that the object of this idea, if it doesn't exist now, had to exist in the past. And in that sense, it's a memory. Um, okay, the question is, yeah, I'll at least get to the point of reading the definition of abstraction, if not farther. So, okay, so after memory, there's a series of other operations. Memory is what allows me to have two ideas at the same time, basically, like the one I'm seeing now and the one I remember. And then based on that, we can do various other things. Um, Discernment, that is noticing that two ideas are not the same. Comparing, that is noticing that two distinct ideas have somehow something in common. Um, and finally, compounding, which means putting together ideas to make bigger ones. And this operation is the source of all complex ideas, right? That is, remember, Locke says that infants first get simple ideas only, and compounding is an operation of the mind. And he thinks that beasts most don't do it very much. And he has some examples of why the times when we think they have a complex idea, they're really just going by one thing, right? Like the example of a dog being willing to nurse baby foxes if they smell like dogs. It's like if you can get them to drink her milk once, then the smell of her milk comes in them, and that's enough, and she doesn't notice anything else about them. Which is interesting. I mean, assuming it's true, it's interesting. um, I think it's been demonstrated for sure that parrots have complex ideas in Locke's sense. Um, uh, and probably also chimpanzees and crows and some other animals. But in any case, be that as it may, right? So there's these three. So these three obviously all depend on memory, right? We get the two ideas together, then we discern them from each other, then we compare them with each other, and then if we wish, we can put them together. Um, well, yeah, I'll just say, and I'll say more about this next time. This compounding operation by which we make complex ideas is only one of the ways that ideas can come together. This is the way that ideas come together voluntarily due to our will. We put them together for some purpose. Ideas also come together in perception, right? Like when the snowball is white and cold. I don't have to have a complex idea containing white and cold. I just sense white and cold at the same time. All right. That's going to be important for understanding the difference between, well, I don't know. It'll be important. I'll say more about it next time. I want to get to reading the definition of abstraction. So, right, this is chapter 11, section 9 of book 2 on page 155. Um, right, so he's just saying that um, and it's interesting, he's already referring forward to the question of words are somehow involved in the necessity of abstraction. So he says, like, if we had to have a name for each particular idea, right? Like Fred for this snowball and Delilah for this snowball and so forth, that we would need too many names. That's it. I mean, that's only part of the problem, as he's going to point out later. They would be useless even if we made them all. So so, and this is the part I want to read. To prevent this, the mind makes the particular ideas received for particular objects to become general, which is done by considering them as they are in the mind, such appearances, separate from all other existences and the circumstances of real existence as time, place, or any other concomitant ideas. Right? So abstraction means, um, and I'm I'm moving towards the solution of that puzzle that I raised to begin with about why aren't the simple ideas that the child takes in first the most abstract ideas of all, like white, which applies to everything white. But if you look carefully at that definition I just read, um, he's not just talking about leaving out random ideas, right? So he's not just talking about, like, I have an idea of Fred, and then I leave out like Fred's color. And I have, right, so now I have a more abstract idea because it's missing this one that I just subtracted or abstracted out of it. He's talking about leaving out something very specific, separate from all other existences. Okay, I mean, that I guess may be talking about this process where we take out other things that have been mixed together. Oh no, 1 minute left and my tripod's falling over. But then he says, um, and the circumstances of real existence as time, place, or any other concomitant ideas. The important thing is we have to leave out this idea of existence, which, remember, means existence at a particular time and a particular place. So, what I'm going to try to explain at a little bit more length at the beginning next time is that the child's simple idea of white doesn't come with other like random ideas, but like every idea, it comes with the idea of existence. So the child's idea of white is the idea of something white here now. It's not abstract at all. And to get the abstraction, we actually have to go through all these processes, put ideas together ourselves, and then we can separate them from the um, concomitants of real existence, like time and place. And even if they're very, very complex, right? Like, even if my idea included everything about Fred, except when Fred existed, it would be abstract. All right, like I said, I'll try to explain that better at the next time at the beginning, and I will see you and hopefully lots more people then. And by the way, that's next time is tomorrow. So I'll see you then. Bye.